read in the Paris Review, and he met Allen Ginsberg, and then he writes this, Creeley, in recalling that time. There are lovely moments in the world when persons and place, quote, burn with a like heat, as Olson would say. Who knows why, finally, except that some intuition or habit or simply coincidence has arranged that this shall be the case. And all those to be blessed truly will be present. I felt that way arriving in San Francisco in March of 1956. And then he goes on. And so he met Kerouac, Snyder, Philip Whalen, Michael McClure, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. But the most significant was surely with Ginsberg, quote from Creeley. We talked endlessly day and night. We rehearsed our senses of writing, possible publication, shop talk. Both Ed Dorn and I were asked a lot of questions about Olson and his projective verse. Was it just more razzle-dazzle intellectualism? McClure and Whalen were particularly intrigued and were at this time already in correspondence with him. Olson. Allen, as always, was alert to any information of process that might be of use. And so ultimately, Allen Ginsberg became one of the contributing editors of the final number of Black Mountain Review, number 7, which included work by all the people above mentioned. This was
wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, just to bring Bob into this conversation and his presence, and also Olson's in a way with the idea of self-publishing, the idea that he said to Jonathan Williams, never be discouraged by the disdain or the disinterest of the world. Just get yourself some paper and some ink and put it out yourself, which I think was like hugely influential for the next generation, your generation of the so-called Mimeo Revolution, Angel Hair, Books and Press, which he did with Louis Warsh, and Big Sky that Bill Berkson published, and Adventures in Poetry by Larry Fagan, but that whole culture, John Wiener's Measure.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you wanted
Secret
to talk
Location
a
on the
little bit
Lower
about
East Side
Yeah.
comes to mind, that wonderful anthology with pictures and sort of a lot of the map and the narratives and so on. Well, it's great that you bring that up because I think a lot about infrastructure and community and then what comes out of that, how the Poetry Project happened and continued because it started with a grant, from the Office of Economic Opportunity under Lyndon Johnson to work with alienated youth on the Lower East Side. That was kind of the specifics around the sociologist at the New School who had gotten this grant and actually came, over and checked things out. And the church had already been available to poets. Paul Blackburn was dragging his woolen sock, and the open readings there, et cetera. And then the filmmakers were using the space, theater folk, Theater Genesis that later had Murray Mednick, Ralph Cook, Sam Shepard's first plays, incredible activity. I mean, it was a real circus of activity on the Lower East Side. So then that grant, which took care of all of us for a while, and then suddenly we had to keep it going because you had to keep it going. And there was so much. I remember these meetings with Paul and Diane Markowski and Ted and people arguing over Jimmy Schuyler, but Jimmy Schuyler never reads, he's not banging at the door to read or whatever. And Kenward and then Edwin was another one who wasn't going to read. So there was this wonderful interconnection between the sort of older generation. But I love that, Bob is talking, and also the East-West, people think these are really separate schools, as you see in the New American Poetry, John Allen's famous book, and these separate schools that aren't really, but I remember once my mother was celebrating Gary Snyder's birthday. Something or other, and Kenneth Koch was there, and Kenneth and Gary had this correspondence. We try to, stay in touch, and so it's just such an odd combo. So that kind of way of, and then always being able to travel and see somebody when you could, that, and of course, Kerouac being this example of a kind of, Johnny Appleseed in those long coast-to-coast journeys. And Allen, the incredible communicator and, sort of, talk about archon. I mean, that's what we were talking about in his deathbed. and take care of Stephen Taylor and make sure Amiri gets this and make sure the tapes and so on. I said, yes, of course. And now I'm still like haunted by the ghost of Allen Ginsberg. I haven't even saved the archive yet. And I said, well, we did this little book. We have a little piece by you in here, Alan, about meditation. And, one of the things our editor was saying, no, we don't need meditation. We need beatniks. And we're like, okay, but, this isn't a robot. We can have at least a little nod to some things that have been around for, like, forever.
So you mentioned your mother, Frances Waldman.
It's all for Frances.
Yeah, and she was an amazing force. I remember her well. But when we had our conversation that's in that book that we did, Fantastic Heritages, I was asking you about, your first hits of poetry, like when you were a kid, and that was really interesting to hear about your, what your parents were bringing and showing you, and you read Diane de Prima's work really early, your first book.
Evergreen Review.
And
my mother had lived in Greece for a decade with, she was the daughter-in-law of the Greek poet Siklianos for 10 years learning Greek and helping with these festivals and translating. And she went over there at 19. She'd gone to Provincetown to paint and then ended up with the son of Siklianos and going off to Greece. And, and then I started thinking about the women like Stein and HD and, people who had to get out of America, to be who they were in a way. And then my mother was very influenced by her mother-in-law, Eva Siklianos, who was bisexual, and she would gamble with Natalie Barney in the Paris, what was that? There's that whole book, Paris, what is it called? Can't remember the name anyway. I remember showing it to my brother Mark Siklianos. He said, I never knew my grandmother was a lesbian. It's never too late. So you should meet Emma's mother, Fanta. And in a way, it's amazing that Emma comes to Naropa and is, as Brenda, these amazing people who, I don't know, just are part of, they helped create it, really. I mean, everybody who, I'll start to cry. Everybody who showed up there contributed something and made it. And Leanne, of course, who's look.
It's
one page.
Yeah.
DIY
in the parlor.
So that sense of, again, the infrastructure, which is the TAS. Peter Wilson was a long time summer. He did the Harry Smith something lectures. I can't remember all
Lectures
the things.
in strange anthropology.
What is it again?
Lectures in strange anthropology.
Strange anthropology. We always have these tags, the outrider tradition. Now you can read about the outrider tradition. It's like this official thing that describes. And we just started, I was using that term sort of casually just to try. We're not outside, but we're kind of parallel to some of these other kinds of programs and so on. But that sense of infrastructure. So, Emma comes and makes things happen.
I think that's one of the things you can really feel in this book too, is the sense of like the community at Naropa, and that's maybe the most special thing about it is the sense of community and people coming there and then wanting to pick up these lineages, that all these stories you're telling, it's like they become part of you and you want to carry it on and you want to keep that alive. And I think we tried to capture some of that in this book with the balance of kind of elders, Alan and William Burroughs and Mary Baraka, but then also newer, more contemporary writers that have come through Naropa in more recent years. And then this sort of intergenerational conversation and how that translates and is carried on.
And we still have a lot of the same problems that the rest of the world has, cancel culture, and suddenly a student, she's writing her thesis on the death of Joan Vollmer, Burroughs's wife, and the horrible, accident William Tell story. And then you have, suddenly Jack Kerouac, how can we use this name? He's a pillar of white supremacy. And I constantly say, I'm no apologist for these guys. I'm not here to, spend my entire life where I'm Ed has joked about I'll come to the door with this old lady with a cane trying to defend the poet. But so yeah, but I'll say Jack Kerouac was an immigrant and from Quebecois and blah 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 and class and this and that, and then had his scholarship to go to Columbia, his taking up with the wrong crowd of people, but hearing some jazz along the way, and trying to build a complicated, more complicated story. So that's what we're trying to do, I think, to show the complicated story, which is also in a way very harmonious. And it's always been exciting to me. I mean, even with the ups and downs with the Buddhist scene and this and that, and when who's in, who's out, the transgressions, the human, where I just want to strangle people. I had a poem where I was strangling Dick Cheney for a while. Bob can tell you about that. I was at something with the Dalai Lama. He just came from the Dalai Lama. So, anyway, but I feel like we've been non-competitive. There's something in Europa that's, even all these normal turmoils of the world, we're not at utopia. We are a temporary autonomous zone for sure, but we don't have to be fixated and institutionalized. And the archive is still in my dream in the Iron Mountain. So we'll see. But the point being that, there's a way that you can, I think, enter the so-called mandala and find and be, interconnected. And I've gone to, classes she's taught, and she's our scholar over there in Cambridge. We went to the Morgan yesterday to study the oldest poetry in civilization, Enhe Duana. It's a beautiful, beautiful show. Sort of celebrates the goddess Inanna and that whole cycle. And this was a living person. There's the ritual story. There's different layers of that kind of story in a way, and then how it affects the literary aspects affect the ritual. And we were talking about that the other day. Just the layers that can come out of poetry, and poetry being what is the word? Syncretic. One of my favorite words, syncretic. Realities, and how we need to build on what we already have, and not abandon some of that. But also, I'm so excited the world has expanded the way it has. So many other cultures and traditions and poetries.
But it's also making me realize the deep need for these alternative education zones, or the different forms of getting education that aren't institutional, that aren't so rigidly structured.
But Barcelona, where she's from, and this is the zone, education zone. That thing of how they're starting a program where all students will be required to study climate change and science of that. This is Barcelona.